Hey guys, thanks for joining me online. I know that this is not the best way to do kind of teaching through the scripture necessarily, but we can't afford to lose a lot of time simply because we're missing school. So what I'm going to do with you guys is I'm going to walk you through this video, the first couple of verses in Romans chapter 3. I'll do my best not to keep it long. I know that these videos aren't always the most fun to watch, but after I read some of your responses and some of the answers to your questions, by the way, the ones I've seen so far, most of you guys did a really good job with that, but it does seem like we're just, there's a couple of dots that we're not connecting really well. And so rather than putting this off and waiting for a while before we dive into this text, so we can really utilize technology, we can utilize things like YouTube, and we can make the most of the time that we're at home. So what we're going to do is we're going to just unpack a couple of verses in Romans chapter 3. I'm also going to link for you guys in the homework assignment, in the email that goes out, a different video that I want you to watch as well. I think it serves as a really good illustration of a point that we're trying to make in the text. And so you'll see that, hopefully that link in your email as well. But let's just do this. Let's start taking apart the first couple of verses of Romans chapter 3. That way we can move forward, and when we get back together in class, we can keep pressing on through chapter 3, okay? All right, so Romans chapter 3 is going to begin with Paul asking a question. So he says in chapter 3, verse 1, he says, "Then what advantage has the Jew?" Okay, so let's really just pause there and let's understand where this question is coming from. We spent the whole last part of chapter 2 really demolishing their worldview from the perspective of those who were coming out of a Jewish background. They thought that they had two massive advantages, right? They believed that the possession of the law was advantageous to them. They believed that circumcision was advantageous to them. And so what Paul was doing at the last part of chapter 2 was saying, well, really, the law cannot give you righteousness and it cannot give life. And so you're looking for the law to do something that it can't do. And so if you're looking to the law to save you, if you're looking to the law to give you righteousness, the law can't do that because the law only acts as an accuser. And so now the Jews are going, wait a second, we thought that was advantageous to us, and you're saying it's not. Well, what about circumcision? And then Paul really unpacks that as well. He says, well, listen, your circumcision is beneficial to you if it represents a transformed heart, a changed and believing heart. But man, if your heart has not been changed, and if your heart is not believing in Jesus, then that means your heart is still hard and stubborn and unrepentant. And really your outward circumcision is really of no advantage to you at all either, if it doesn't actually represent a changed and transformed heart. And so what we did was we took away from the Jews these two things that they thought were just absolutely an advantage to them. And so now the Jews have got to be asking the question, well, if the law isn't advantageous to us, or circumcision isn't advantageous to us, and those really are the two things that we're really leaning into and holding on to, then what is? Then what is of value? What is advantageous for us? And so Paul's anticipating this question. And so while he's anticipating, he's going to go ahead and address it in chapter 3, verse 1. Then what advantage has the Jew, right? If circumcision and the law aren't advantageous to us, or at least in the way that we thought they were, I think that's a better way for us to think about it, that they weren't advantageous in the way that they thought that they were. Then they're having to ask, then do we have any advantages? As God's chosen people, do we have any advantages at all? And Paul answers his own question, right? He says, I guess I need to read the rest of verse 1, right? He says, then what advantage has the Jew, or what is the value of circumcision? And so Paul answers his question now. He says, much in every way. So being Jewish has, according to Paul, many advantages. coming out of a Jewish background, it puts you in a position that many others are not in. So there's a lot of advantages to coming out of this Jewish background. He says, much in every way. And so what I want to point out here as well is what we're anticipating then at this point is we're anticipating that Paul is going to give us several ways in which coming out of a Jewish background is advantageous. But what we're actually going to see in the text is that Paul only really gives us one way, okay? So don't be fooled by that. Paul kind of starts to not really chase a rabbit. He starts to dive into the details of his first answer, and then he just never really comes back to the other ways in which it's advantageous to be coming out of a Jewish background. So he says much in every way, but then he's going to say, but to begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. Okay, so that's where he's going to start his answer of what's advantageous about coming out of a Jewish background. He's going to say much in every way, but to begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. And so right there we need to pause and we need to ask the question, what are the oracles of God? And most of you, I felt like, got this right in the answers or the responses that I saw in the work that you guys turned back into me. But some of you kind of missed this a little bit, and so we want to make sure that we're defining what the oracles of God are. And so the oracles of God are really the words of God. And so what we're thinking, if we're thinking really specifically, we're thinking about the law, the Mosaic law, and what God delivered to the Jews at Mount Sinai. But we know that that's not just the Ten Commandments, that really is all of the Pentateuch or all of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. But really, probably what we really need to do is actually get even broader than that. And when we think about the oracles of God, we're probably thinking about the entire Old Testament, because it's not just the law that was revealed to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. It was also the prophecies and the things that the prophets were proclaiming as well. So when we think about the oracles of God, we're thinking about the very words of God revealed to the Jewish people through the Old Testament. And so Paul says, man, like, you guys have the Old Testament. This is an absolute advantage to you. No other people, no other nation, no other group, no other tribe, no one else had the very words of God delivered to them. That is something that you, the Jewish people, alone possessed, and that is incredibly advantageous. That's a huge advantage to you all. And so think about this, right? If someone were to go and to start their own business, we would want to ask about their background, right? And so if we had somebody who went to college, pursued an undergraduate degree in the field of business, went on to get their MBA from a big school like Duke or something else, and then said, okay, now we're going to open a business, would we think that individual has an advantage over maybe someone who is just a high school graduate? Well, I think most of us would say, of course, that person has an advantage. They were trained in an undergraduate degree. They went on past their undergraduate degree to get a master's in business. This person has learned all about business. They've learned all about things like supply and demand. They've learned all about, a product and how to create a product or a service. And not only that, but how to market that product or service. And so we would assume, right, our assumption would be that individual who gets an undergraduate degree in business and then goes on to get their MBA is going to have an advantage in starting their business over someone who doesn't have that kind of training. And so it doesn't mean that the person who only has a high school diploma won't be successful in business. It doesn't mean that they can't create their own business and run their own business successfully. But we would say that it would be advantageous. It would definitely be an advantage to have an undergraduate degree and a master's degree in the field of business, that person's probably going to be better equipped to successfully launch, run, and maintain a business. That seems to make sense to us. Now, let's go back to the Jewish people, and they're asking, what advantage do we have as a people? Right? If possessing the law doesn't give us righteousness, and if circumcision doesn't give us righteousness, then you're saying those things aren't of any advantage to us. And Paul actually goes, but actually no, having the law is, and having the words of God is an advantage to you all, because here's what you're going to learn through those Old Testament scriptures. You're going to learn what sin is. God's law, those first 5 books, are going to help you identify what sin is. And then not just the law, but the prophets as well are then going to begin to point you to your need for deliverance from sin. And not only is the law and the prophets going to show you that you need to be delivered from your sin, but they're also going to begin to proclaim a Messiah who is going to come and who will rescue you from sin, right? And so if I have the law, if I have the prophets, if I have the oracles of God, the words of God, the scriptures aren't saving me. That's not what's happening. And so it's not advantageous in that way. The Old Testament scripture is not saving me, but what the scriptures are doing is it's pointing me towards the Messiah who can save me, right? So now what I can be doing is I can be recognizing that I have a sin problem. I can be recognizing that I need deliverance and I need salvation, and then I can be putting my faith in that Messiah who is to come. Right? So Paul is going, yes, as a Jewish individual, or as an individual coming out of a Jewish background, you have a clear advantage because you have these words of God that were pointing you towards Messiah that no other people, no other nation, no other tribe had. And so, yes, it is advantageous to have the scriptures, and it is an advantage that no one else had. But then he's going to go on and he's going to ask another question. Okay, so yes, you have the words of God, and yes, that is advantageous to you. But now let's pick up in verse 3. He asks another question in verse 3. He says, well, what if some were unfaithful? And there's a little bit of question in the text as to whether or not that word there should be unfaithful or unbelieving. I would actually argue that it could be either one, and the meaning doesn't change all that much. Okay? He asked the question, what if some were unfaithful? In other words, what if they're not doing the law? What if they're breaking the law that God gave them? And I asked the question in the assignment that I gave you guys, were there Jews who were unfaithful? And you guys were like, yes, of course, there were Jews who were unfaithful. There were Jews who weren't doing the things that God had commanded. But what I want us to remember is that our actions are always an overflow of our heart and our identity and what we're believing. And so when we think about the unfaithful acts, I asked you guys, well, what would their unfaithfulness also be revealing? And some of you guys gave me, well, I got really a multitude of different responses there. But what I was really hoping that you guys would connect those unfaithful acts to is that those acts are flowing out of a certain kind of heart, right? So if our unfaithfulness or if our unfaithful acts or our disobedience to the law is what we are doing, then the question that we also want to ask is, what kind of heart is that coming out of? And we would say, well, that those unfaithful acts, those acts of disobedience, would be coming out of a heart that is still hard and stubborn and unrepentant. Those unfaithful acts are really just a demonstration or a tangible expression of an unbelieving heart. Right? So if the word is better translated unbelieving, then we would ask the question, well, what kind of actions would we expect to come out of an unbelieving heart? And we would say, well, we would expect acts of unfaithfulness or acts of disobedience. If the word is unfaithful, then we're expecting those unfaithful acts, because we saw back in chapter 2, verse 5, that our hearts are hard and stubborn and disobedient, that we've been given over to the lust of our hearts, to impurity, that we've been given over to dishonorable passions, that we've been given over to a debased mind. So that's really what we're expecting, right? He asked the question, first question in verse 3, what if some were unfaithful? Well, then in Paul's mind, that begins to beg another question, right? Because we know that there were some Jews who were, in fact, unfaithful. So he asks a follow-up question. Does their faithlessness, right? So that not faithfulness, does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? And here's where I was really asking you guys to do your best to make some connections. And this is a hard connection to make. And so I think we struggled as a whole with this. We kind of struggled to connect the dots. So I wanted to help you guys connect the dots here. Okay? Paul's saying, yes, we know, of course, there were Jews. All of the Jews, in fact, were unfaithful. We know that, right? But does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? So here's where we have to kind of put the pieces together to understand what it is that Paul was trying to get those Jewish people to wrestle with, okay? And here's what we've got to unpack, or we've got not necessarily we do have to unpack it, but we need to first get in the right mindset, all right? And I ask you guys the question, how did the Jews understand themselves, or what was their identity in relationship with God? And you guys said, well, they were the chosen people of God, okay? So here's what I want you to understand. Yes, they were chosen people of God. They were chosen people of God who were given the law, and no other people, no other nation, no other group were given either that title or that gift. And so from the Jewish perspective, listen carefully, from the Jewish perspective, they were a privileged people because no other nation, no other group had that title. No other nation, no other group had that law given to them. So they were a privileged people. Now, here's what we have to understand. This is an assumption that I think a lot of us, just in our sinful nature, carry around with us. We don't always recognize it. We don't always verbalize it, but I think this is true, okay? Privileged people often think that they cannot be judged, okay? Let me say that again. Privileged people often believe that they cannot be judged, all right? In fact, many people would say that because I am privileged, that frees me from ever being judged. And if I am judged, if I were to ever be judged, then that would mean that I wasn't privileged to begin with. Right? So there's this assumption that that lives in our hearts, this idea that privileged people cannot be judged. Okay? And so what's happening here is that these people coming out of a Jewish background are believing that they were privileged. They had the title of chosen people, and they had the law. And that meant that they were different. That meant they were unique. That meant they were set apart. That meant that they were privileged. But listen to the argument, right? What if here's the question in verse 3. What if some were unfaithful? And Paul has just gone on to make the argument in chapter 2 that yes, you were in fact faithful. Look back at chapter 2, verse 23. He said, you who boast in the law dishonor God by breaking the law. So Paul's already pointed out that they were acting unfaithfully. Then he went on to say back in verse 9, so go back to chapter 2 and verse 9, that there will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil. The Jew first, and also the Greek. Then drop down 2 verses to verse 11. What is that based in? It's based in the reality of verse 11 that God shows no partiality. Okay? So now for those who are coming out of a Jewish mindset, they're struggling here. Wait a second. I believe that I'm privileged. And I believe that because I'm privileged, I cannot be judged. But you're saying that I have been unfaithful, that I have broken the law. That's chapter 2, verse 23. That because I've broken the law, that I'm going to be judged. That's chapter 2, verse 9. The Jew first. And that all of that is based in the character and nature of God. Verse 11, chapter 2, verse 11, that God doesn't show partiality. So here's what I don't understand, right? I'm the Jew, or the one coming out of the Jewish background. You're saying that if I'm unfaithful, God is going to judge me. But doesn't that make God a liar? Because God has said that I am privileged. He has not only said it, he has shown it. He's called me a part of his chosen people, and he's given me the law. God has declared that I am privileged. And if God judges me, and privileged people can't be judged, if God judges me, doesn't that make God a liar? Right? Listen to this, right? This is verse 3. What if some were unfaithful? And they were. You guys pointed that out. Does their faithfulness, right? Not faithfulness. Does their faithlessness, their disobedience, right? And what goes along with that, according to chapter 2, is judgment, because God doesn't show partiality. So does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? Because God has said that I'm privileged. God has said that I'm his chosen people. And if God is going to judge me, his privileged chosen people, well, doesn't that make him unfaithful? Because shouldn't God be keeping his privileged people safe? Shouldn't God be keeping his privileged people from judgment? Shouldn't God be keeping his privileged people from punishment? Right? That seems like that's what a faithful God would do. And if you're saying that he's going to judge me because of my faithfulness, well, then what you're basically saying is that nullifies God's faithfulness. And Paul goes, no. Listen, you're acting on a wrong assumption that privileged people can't be judged. The reality is that privileged people can absolutely be judged. They may not like it when it happens, but they can absolutely be judged. So Paul answers his question in verse 4, by no means. Let God be true, even though every one were a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged, right? And so he said, listen, God is true to his character. And when God judges justly. He doesn't judge unjustly. And so your disobedience is deserving of his judgment. And so yes, there's a privileged title that you have, and there's advantages to coming out of a Jewish background and having the law, but your privileged position doesn't mean that you can't be judged. I want to demonstrate this to you guys, so I'm going to include in the email a link to another video, and this is a video, it's a movie scene from the movie Wonder, and maybe some of you guys have seen that and maybe you haven't, but let me just set the stage for you. What's going on in that movie scene is that there is a boy who is coming from a privileged family, and he has been bullying another boy that goes to the school, another boy that was born with a facial deformity. And so as he's been called, when you enter into the movie scene, what you see is that the boy's been called into the principal's office with his two parents. Again, highly privileged family. And when the principal begins to say to the boy, listen, there's going to be a punishment for your behavior. There's going to be a punishment for your bullying. Then what you're going to see from the parents, and I think this is such a clear example of this underlying assumption that I think all of us have. His parents immediately begin to push back against the principal, essentially arguing, you can't judge us because we are privileged. Okay? And I think this movie clip does such a good job of bringing that reality out that we need to see that. We need to understand that that was kind of an underlying assumption for the Jewish people. And some of us, listen guys, some of us need to wrestle with that underlying assumption in our own hearts. That our privileged position, whether it's our wealth or just being Americans and living in America, that our privilege doesn't mean that we can't be judged. And so we need to be aware of that. So I think that's going to be a helpful scene for for you guys to think through, okay? So let me real quickly just look at verses 5 and following, and I won't spend long on these because maybe I'll give you guys some things to consider, and you guys can do this on your own, okay? But then in verse 5, Paul says, "But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us?" And he says here, I speak in human way. And he says, "By no means. For then how could God judge the world? But if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil that good may come, as some people slanderously charge with saying, their condemnation is just." Okay, so let me just give you a real quick illustration, and then I'm going to maybe give you guys some things to work on, and you guys can send them back to me or maybe submit them in class. I guess next week is probably what we'll do, okay? But here's I want you to imagine a situation with me, okay? I want you to imagine that you have really severe allergies, okay? You've got allergies that are really, really bad. And let's just to make it more specific, let's say that you have a really bad allergy to pollen. Okay, so bad that most of the time on a normal day that you can't even go out because the low pollen counts would cause your allergies to flare up really bad. You'd have a difficult time breathing, and so most of the time that you are required to stay indoors because of your allergy to pollen. Now, here's what I want you to imagine. Imagine that there's a medication that comes out that takes away the symptoms of that allergic reaction so completely, right? That this medicine or this pill that you take on a daily basis gives you freedom that you've never had before. Like now you're able to spend all kinds of time outside. And when you go outside, you don't cough, you don't sneeze, your eyes don't run or don't water, your nose doesn't run. This medicine just relieves every symptom of your pollen allergy that you have ever experienced. In fact, you don't experience any of those symptoms anymore, right? We would go, that's a great pill. That's a great medicine. In fact, man, I just want to prove, or maybe some of us would think, most of us probably would not think this way, but maybe some of us would think this way. Some of us would maybe even go, listen, I am so grateful for this pill. I'm so thankful for the pill. In fact, I believe in the power of this pill so much that I want to demonstrate it to everybody. And what better way to demonstrate the power of this allergy pill than not to stay in where I presently live that maybe on occasion has some high pollen days. No, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move to an area of the country that has a ridiculous amount of pollen. Because here's what I want people to see. I want them to see that this pill that I take on a daily basis doesn't just take away the symptoms from a little bit of pollen. No, this pill is so powerful, this pill is so great that it takes away symptoms from pollen even in the places where there is more pollen than any other place in the world, right? So you move to this place where it's basically like this big yellow dust cloud where the pollen is so bad each and every day. But what happens is every day you take that pill and you go outside and you work outside and you never experience those symptoms, then you would go, listen, what I'm doing is actually a good thing. It's showing the power of this pill. It's showing how great this pill is, that this pill is able to overcome even the greatest amounts of pollen. All right, now with that illustration in mind, that's essentially what Paul is arguing that we should be doing with our sin. Listen. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what should we say? Right? If, in other words, if my unrighteousness, if my disobedience serves to show that God is righteous in his judgment, isn't what I'm really doing putting his character on display in an even more clear and a better way? Like if my unrighteousness causes others to see, whoa, God is judging him for his unrighteousness. God is punishing him for his unrighteousness. God is acting against his unrighteousness. I mean, doesn't that at the end of the day just serve to show that God really is righteous? And if what I'm doing is showing that God really is righteous, aren't I highlighting one of his greatest attributes, one of his greatest character, one of the greatest parts of his character? I mean, at the end of the day, what I'm doing is serving to put God in a better light. It's showing who he is. So what if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God? Then what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I mean, at the end of the day, if my unrighteousness is serving to show that God really is righteous, then I'm putting him in a better light. I'm highlighting one of his character attributes. So why should he punish me for that? Why should he punish me for making him look better? Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? If I'm making God look better, there shouldn't be a punishment that comes with that. There shouldn't be judgment that comes with that. I mean, at the end of the day, God should be kind of grateful that I'm putting his power or putting his nature on display in an even better way. And Paul says, but man, if we think that way, that's really just speaking or thinking in human ways. And so he says, by no means, right? We can't think that God is actually being unrighteous and inflicting wrath on us for our disobedience. He goes on to say, for then how could God judge the world? Okay, so this really is going to bring us to our next question. And maybe I want you, I'll write this more clearly in the email, but this is what I want you guys to think about as you maybe look at those last couple of verses. But here's the deal, right? God is a judge. He is the judge, and he will judge sin. And so, right, those with the Jewish background are kind of trying to figure out, how can I wiggle out of this idea that I'm going to have to endure, or that I deserve the wrath of God and I deserve his punishment? Well, even if I do wrong, doesn't that just serve to show that he is righteous and that he is good? And Paul says, sorry, and wouldn't it be actually unrighteous of him to then therefore punish me because I'm putting his character on display more clearly? And Paul says, no, it's not about that, because God is a judge and he has to judge justly. Okay, so here's what I want you guys to think about, and we'll wrap this up and we'll get into the other verses in class later. But maybe I'll have you respond to this in an assignment. But here's the question I want us to think about, right? Can a just judge ever judge unjustly? Right? I want you to think about that. Can a just judge ever judge unjustly, or must a just judge always judge justly? We've got to think about that, right? Because God's character is really at question. It's at stake here. And so, can a just judge ever judge unjustly, or must a just judge always judge justly? We've got to make sure we understand that with some clarity so that we don't begin to try to wiggle out of what our sin deserves and understanding what God has done for us in Christ, okay? All right, so we'll finish up the video with that. Make sure you watch the other YouTube movie clip that I link, and then I'll probably post a few questions in the email that I'd love for you guys to respond to. But I hope you guys are doing well. I miss seeing you in class, and I look forward to seeing you guys next week, okay? All right, bye guys.